Ooh, Thoughtseize. Sees nothing. Sees Reflecting Pool. Yeah, Gabriel Nassif playing off the top of the deck. That's what we talked about. This is Orsini Jones's plan. Get some threats. Top deck or no. Cruel Ultimatum is the card he's hoping to top deck. And... Oh! Oh my God! Ultimatum! Off the top! Wow! Oh my goodness. Draw 3 cards. Oh, and by the way, draw 3 cards.
Card draw. It's always been at the heart of the game. But what if that was no longer the case? Doomsday. Since its debut in Weatherlight back in 1997, players have had to think about how can they win with only 5 cards? The power of having exactly what you need on top at the cost of everything else. The ultimate battle between risk and reward that asks you specifically, what would you give to achieve victory? And many players have tried to answer this question, whether it be with a complex storm loop, copying tendrils to drain your opponent out, or drawing enough cards to win with Thassa's Oracle in an empty deck. Doomsday has been rewarding those who can find those perfect 5 cards in Eternal formats for decades. So why am I talking about an Eternal staple printed back in 1997 in our most recent Standard Deep Dive? To answer that question, let me pose another question. Have you been looking for a control deck that can win the game quickly? Have you felt like this when playing Standard recently?
The number of games where, you play, your opponent just plays Beanstalk on 2 and you're just like, again, right?
If you want to play something that's not aggressive but punishes card draw better than any other deck in the format, or you will make Domain regret their up the beanstalks, we must go to a card that harkens back to the days of old, Doomsday Excruciator. Rather than sculpting our deck for a later win, Excruciator forces doom on both players, leaving our fates to our last few cards. This deck aims to twist that fate to our advantage. At its core, this is a Dimir combo control deck that's built around keeping your head above water until you can stick a Doomsday Excruciator, and then milling out your opponent's final cards before you deck out yourself. One of the core strengths of the deck is you get to invalidate your opponent's card advantage, as once your opponent is down to 6 cards in deck, they can't exactly afford to draw too many more. Up the Beanstalk is the biggest target here, but there are plenty of other cards like Enduring Curiosity, Ritual Chamber, and Stock Up that go from standard powerhouses to unplayable or even a liability. Remember, with effects like Beans and Cat, the card draw is not optional, so if you put them down to 6 cards in deck, you can lock them out of their main game plan entirely. Even if they ground out some value prior to you casting the demon, the game immediately becomes about the demon after you play it, virtually invalidating any cards that don't interact on that axis. One of the other big draws to the deck is you're incredibly good at blanking most of your opponent's removal, since not only do you not need to deal damage to win the game, but in fact most of your wins are done completely outside of combat. Even if your opponent does kill the Excruciator on its way down, once the ETB happens, the damage is already done. And if one Moto 5-0 league can be taken as fact, we can do this damage quite consistently. This deck's also very attractive from a gameplay perspective if you're looking for a controlling deck that can also win quickly. Unlike other options like Domain and Azorius Control, while they're both strong in their own right, they can take a long time to complete matches, especially if paired up against each other. There's a very real risk in a paper event where rounds are 50 minutes with 5 additional turns if necessary that you will not finish your match in time and draw with your opponent. However, with this deck, the game will end 1 to 2 turns after you drop the demon, guaranteed. These style of decks have always been my favorite to play since they give you a lot of agency in the game, and these games can be quite varied from those where you're the aggressor, trying to mill at your domain opponent before they can kill you with overlords, to those where you're the control player, trying to keep your head above water in the face of a mouse onslaught. It's very similar to the Inverter of Truth combo decks that used to run around in Pioneer before the aforementioned card was banned, where you play a slower, grindy game, trading removal and discard with your opponent's threats to slow them down, and pave the way for your combo. Then when it's time to slam the door shut, you can do so in short order. And if you're getting compared to a deck that got banned, that's a pretty good place to be. Speaking of bans, I have a sneaking suspicion that Up the Beanstalk may not exist in about 2 weeks with our upcoming BNR announcement on March 31st, 2025. Luckily, even if that does happen, I still believe this deck will be a strong choice in the meta because its ability to punish slower decks is not limited to just Domain. In fact, I think this deck has the strongest inevitability in the format, and I don't say that lightly. You may have seen some Excruciator decks prior to this, namely Javier Dominguez's Dimir Demons deck from Worlds, but this deck has gotten some incredibly major upgrades from Aether Drift, and I'm certain you've seen nothing like this. So without further ado, let's get on to the card breakdown. Our deck building decisions are strongly influenced by the whopping 6 black mana pips in Excruciator's mana cost, and that influence certainly starts with the lands. For a mana base, I actually find it quite interesting. We're on 26 lands since the deck has a fairly high mana curve with the Demon, and every single one of those 26 lands is capable of producing black mana that can be used to cast Excruciator. 8 lands that always enter tapped may seem like a lot, but they're actually critical here. The Surveil lands, on top of keeping our blue mana source count high, allow us to have enough swamps in the deck to consistently enable our verges, and the selection is really nice in finding the right interaction or assembling the combo. The 4 Restless Reefs are probably the best land in the deck, since they are a dual land that also combos with our main win condition by milling 4 of the 6 cards left in our opponent's deck after just 1 attack. The Darkslick Shores and Verges are probably self-evident as to why we're on 4, but it may be surprising to see that we're only on 2 Underground River. It turns out in practice, in a deck like this, where we have such extreme colored mana requirements, the damage from 1 or more rivers start to add up fast, and we still have 18 blue sources, which is more than enough to cast the cards we need to. The Cavern of Souls are there to make our Doomsday Excruciators uncounterable, which is really important for pushing through a sorcery speed 6-drop that we often need to win games against Azorius Control or Dimir midrange. The fact we can do this at such a low opportunity cost is really awesome and can often flip these matchups on their head. Now that we've talked about the mana used to cast it, we can start with the card of the hour, Doomsday Excruciator. This card is the driving force of the deck, and is very powerful in a multitude of ways. Don't be afraid to toss him right into your opponent's removal, since as we said before, the ETB is really what's doing the work here. The 6/6 body can be useful as a final roadblock before closing things out. However, I found it's not really fast enough to beat our opponents down in this deck. I often will just drop the Demon, even if I don't have a way to mill my opponent out. Since we have a critical mass of mill cards in our deck, we're likely enough to draw one in the top 6. But you will eventually die to the card draw ability if you have no way to stop it. Although in practice, this is quite rare, since if you just drop it with no fear, your opponent kinda has to answer it if they can, and if it gets killed right away, your opponent will deck out naturally first. It's actually kind of insane how strong the text on this card is. Wizards clearly knew what they were doing when they made it 6 black mana to cast. And for our only other creature, we have 4 copies of Oil Deep Gearhulk. This is an incredibly massive addition we got from Aether Drift that makes this archetype even possible. Although it is a creature, it doesn't actually die to much of the creature rule being played right now. Go for the throat? Nope. Anoint with Affliction? Hope you're playing Toxic. Nowhere to run? Almost, but not quite. Cut down? Yeah, no. Even the removal that can hit it is made pretty clunky by the Ward 1. But removal aside, this card is insane at clearing the way and buying time. You get to look at your opponent's hand, know exactly what to play around, and take the critical threat or piece of interaction that was going to stop you. And if your opponent doesn't have anything you care about, just take nothing. I'm sure they'll feel great about their chances after you look at their whole hand and go, yeah, you're good. It's also great post-Doomsday, since the draw is not optional, so you can force your opponent to draw when they have 6 or less cards in their deck. You can target yourself too if you need to dig for something, and it doesn't say non-land, so go ahead and discard that useless land. And on top of all of that, the lifelink is incredible at stemming the bleeding against aggro, and padding your life total in every other matchup, to the point where your opponent can't hope to kill you before you drop Doomsday Excruciator. And I know I said you don't often win by damage, but you can just kill your opponent by chaining Gearhulks. Now that we've talked about the first half of our combo, let's see how we actually mill them out. Jace should be no surprise, as the card is pretty strong in these more controlling style decks already, and works perfectly with Excruciator by easily decking out our opponent post-Demon. You can even play Jace on a prior turn to win immediately when you play Doomsday Excruciator. Jace can also mill on his own without the Demon, but we don't do this as consistently as Azorius Control. He will normally come down and stall with his plus, and then draw some cards with his -2 before we're ready to combo off. Unless we're about to kill our opponent, we'll normally mill ourselves since we have minor graveyard synergies, one of which we'll talk about right now. Founding of the Third Path is one of those cards that's really strong, but often hard to find a home for. We found a good place for it here though, as we have a large density of cheap spells to cast and flash back with it, and the mill 4 in Chapter 2 is often game after we drop the demon. Much like Jace, we are normally milling ourselves if we aren't winning the game that turn, but don't be afraid to turn the mill on your opponents if the situation calls for it. So to give Founding a little more context, let's switch over to our spells. We are on 4 cutdown since we need the early interaction to stay afloat. Without the great board wipes like Temporary Lockdown or Wrath of God that White get access to, this is our best option to stem the bleeding against aggro. Being able to kill Zur on the cheap is nice too, even if the card isn't great against Domain. It also works well with Founding as a thing we can cast on Chapter 1 and flash back for cheap on Chapter 3. I've opted for 1 Duress to give us more ways to interact with our opponent on turn 1, and if you've seen my other videos, you probably already know how much I like the card. It also gives us a proactive play that we can use with Founding of the Third Path, both on Chapter 1 and Chapter 3. I wouldn't play more than 1 though, since against creature decks, drawing too many copies of Duress can easily be a death sentence. But in the black-based sorcery speed combo deck, discard is going to be how we interact. And to go with our 1 Duress, we have 3 copies of Cruel Claw's Heist. This may be one of the first times you're seeing this card, but I can assure you it's incredibly strong. It gets any card regardless of type. It's one of the best cards you can proactively cast off of Founding of the Third Path. The double black is inconsequential when we're casting a 6 black pip card, and the gift giving is incredibly powerful in the right context. Against reactive decks like Azorius Control or Domain, I'm almost always giving them the gift, since I can often snipe their 1 important card and then leave them with a bunch of useless removal while I cast said card. Nothing's more satisfying than drawing into my combo using the stock up I stole from my opponent's deck. Playing to your outs takes on a whole new meaning when you can also play to drawing the right card from your opponent's deck. The Exile is also super nice for breaking up any graveyard loops like This Town Ain't Big Enough and Storm Chaser's Talent for good. Together, the Gearhulks, Duress, Heists, and Founding of the Third Path flashbacks create a potent discard package that can rip apart our opponent's hands and pave the way for us to combo off. Demonic Council is a strange one of, but the card has performed incredibly well. Between the Jaces, Foundings, and Gearhulks, this deck has no trouble getting Delirium, and often you just want to tutor for your demon anyway. Having a flexible tutor instead of the 4th Excruciator also helps us get out of awkward situations where we draw multiple demons when we really only need 1. We can even mill it over, then flash it back with Chapter 3 of Founding, or cast it for free with the first chapter. I thought about adding a second one, but you never really want to draw more than 1. Go for the Throat is still the best way to unconditionally kill things for the most part, and it's great with Founding. I was on 1 copy of Anoint in the main instead of the 3rd Go for the Throat for a while, but there were enough situations that came up where I needed to kill something that costed greater than 3 mana, like a Sheoldred, that I opted for the 3rd here. I don't think you're giving up too many percentage points against red with this choice, but if you want to run Anoint here, I wouldn't fault you for it. We have an interesting removal option here in Quag Feast, but it actually fills a crucial role. We can be weak to a Kaido or opposing Jace running away with the game, especially game 1, so having a removal spell that can cleanly remove these sticky threats is really nice. We mill so much in this deck that the card will basically always be online, and the mill on the card itself can help if we mill relevant spells to flash back with Founding. The sorcery speed downside can also be circumvented by casting it off of Chapter 1 of Founding of the Third Path. The other major upgrade we got from Aether Drift is Stock Up. We put the card selection to strong use here, and while we can't cast it for free with Chapter 1 of Founding, we certainly can flash it back with Chapter 3, allowing us to dig incredibly deep into our deck for exactly what we need. Without card selection this strong, I'm not sure this combo could be executed with any level of consistency. Another very important note about Stock Up in this deck specifically is the cards that you don't take, not only do they go on the bottom of your library, but they go on the bottom in any order. That means after you cast the demon, and you exile all the cards besides your bottom 6, you'll not only know what the cards on the bottom are, but you will know the order in which you'll draw them. This actually could be pretty important, because let's say you put a Jace at the bottom of your deck to mill them out. You'll know then you can go for the demon and that you will draw it eventually. Rounding out our spells, we have 1 copy of Deadly Cover-Up. If you watched our Catch from Most video, you already know how much I like this card too, but here it serves the role as a nice catch-up card that we can find incidentally off our stock-ups or Founding of the Third Paths, if needed. We don't want to run more than 1 since it's a pretty clunky 5-drop, but the 1 copy does go a long way by pulling us back from behind when we need it. We can also tutor it up with Demonic Council if we have Delirium. Now onto the sideboard, we have 2 more copies of Duress, We're bringing this in against our normal suspects like Domain, Esper Bounce, Azorius, and anything I think is going to bring in a lot of reactive spells to try and stop my combo, or anywhere I suspect my cutdowns are going to be unplayable pieces of cardboard. We are on the 4th copy, since with the heists, I found 6 discard spells as the nice sweet spot for interacting in the early game without getting discard flooded. We still have the Gearhulk too if we need to attack the hand later in the game. Ghost Vacuums here is our graveyard hit of choice against all the random decks that care about that stuff like Azorius Omniscience or Jeskai Oculus. We aren't doing anything too fancy with it, but it's still the best generalized graveyard hate spell in Standard. In this deck, I only bring it in against dedicated graveyard decks, even though in the past I've sometimes liked it against creature-heavy decks like Golgari. While Anoint didn't make it in the main deck, I like having one on the board to answer threats with annoying death triggers like Heartfire Hero. It can also be brought in just to increase your spot removal count, regardless of the exile if it's needed. You'll usually know when you want it, and it's here for when you do. And they said blocking is dead against red. Kay Lorna giving 8 toughness for 2 mana is so much, and it's nice to have something you can just deploy to stem the bleeding against red, without having to hold it up like a removal spell. Given it's legendary, you will literally never play the 2nd copy, but I think the 1 is stronger than other potential aggro sideboard cards like Disfigure or the 2nd Anoint. I could be wrong though. We are not in white-black, so we don't get pest control. The Silex does do a good pest control impression though, so it's strong against Esper Bounce regardless. Plus, you can just drop it down, and the threat of activation could slow your opponent down enough to pave the way for your combo. Eclipse is a really nice 1-of that can have its moments against red and a mere midrange, but it can be awkward in multiples. Against red, you need to be careful if they have a pump spell in response, because that can be a huge blowout. It's also great against go-wide strategies like Convoke, but they aren't really played much right now. Preacher does a ton of work in the sideboard, and we're happy to be on the 3 copies. Its primary purpose is to serve as a roadblock against red aggro, where the high toughness paired with the death touch can slow them down quite effectively. But it also comes in against decks that either you want to trim your removal against, or suspect that they are trimming their removal against you so that you can snowball with the card draw. You can also bring it in against Esper Bounce if you suspect that they aren't going to have the right removal for it, but I don't really do this every time. The fact the card can shine against both very aggressive and very controlling decks makes it a strong tool for a wide variety of situations. Tidebinder is another one of those great catch-all cards that we bring in often. Its main purpose is to come in against Domain, Azorius Control, and even Dimir to slow down anything from an Overlord to a Zur to even a Kaido. But I've even used it to stop random things like the Stonebrain from removing all of my Doomsday Excruciators. It can sometimes be okay against red, but I normally don't bring it in there. It even has a niche interaction where you can tidebind your own Excruciator's draw trigger to prevent you from decking before your opponent does, since not only does it counter the card draw, but it removes the ability from the demon to draw more entirely. Normally, you'll be able to parse out what matchups you want it in by paying close attention to what cards your opponents play game 1. If there are abilities you want to counter, bring in those Tidebinders. The Tidebinders and Preachers are easily your most utilized sideboard cards. Now that we've gone over the deck, let's talk about some of the matchups. Like I've said in previous videos, Standard is fairly diverse, especially on the arena ladder, so we're going to talk about some of the most popular decks, but we're certainly not going to cover everything. Red aggro can be tough if they have a fast start, especially if they're on the play. However, we do have a lot of spot removal early, and Oil Deep Gearhulk does a great job at turning the corner in the mid-game. Your path to victory is normally to hold on for dear life until you can slam a demon and close out the game shortly after that. In post-board games, bring in your extra removal, Kay Lorna, and Preachers in exchange for your discard suite and a couple Jaces. The Domain matchup is nearly unlosable, and one of the main reasons to play this deck. They have no way to stop the combo, and the only way they can put enough pressure on you to kill you before that happens is with a quick Zur draw, and we even have the tools to stop this. I will almost always cast Cruel Claw's Heist on the Gift here, since we can often take their important cards like Beams or Overlord, and then strand them with a bunch of useless removal. Bring in your extra discard and Tidebinders, and take out your cutdowns and Quag Feasts. While not as much of a free win like Domain, the Esper Bounce matchup is also quite solid, with them rarely being able to put enough pressure on you before you can win with Excruciator. Don't be afraid to fire off removal spells on Otter tokens, Fear of Isolations, or Nurturing Pixies, where even if it's a bad exchange on resources, all you need is time to win. Kaido's a card to watch out for here, since it can put on a lot of pressure while also drawing cards. Try to keep them off of Queen Ninjutsu, or prioritize hitting him with your discard spells. I normally trim some Jaces, a Gearhulk, and a Go for the Throat or two for Duresses, Silexes, and the Eclipse. Dimir can be a little harder due to the aforementioned efficacy of Kaido against us, but as long as we can keep them off their heavy hitters, they have a hard time putting on enough pressure. After the demon comes down, their best cards quickly turn into their worst, since they're at a real risk of decking. Also, watch out for their own Restless Reefs to mill you out. But even if they do mill you for 4, you'll still have 2 cards left in your deck, allowing you to untap and draw them, and then you can execute the combo. I normally will just bring in the Tidebinders and maybe a Duress to stop their heavy hitters in exchange for some Jaces and a couple Foundings. Azorius Control is another very good matchup for us, and like Domain, we can gift with Cruel Claw's Heist very effectively. We do need to be careful when we go for combo though, since they also run 4 copies of Jace. If we just drop the demon with no follow-up and then they do have a Jace, we'll be the ones getting milled out. It can be advantageous to try to stick a Jace before going for it so we can mill them out in 1 turn, but even with this line we still need to be careful because if we just have the Jace, they can respond with Get Lost on that Jace with the ETB trigger of the demon on the stack, and then untap and Jace us out regardless. With all the discard we're running, we can normally find a window to go for the combo without it backfiring in our faces. And that's it! I hope you enjoyed this deep dive on another unexplored deck, and let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more content like this, or gameplay of these decks in action. I also wanted to thank you so much for your support in my last video. You all seem to like competitive brews, which I'm more than happy to make. If you like that kind of content and want to see us build around Ketramos, you can also check that out here. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.
Ray shields. Wait a minute. How did this happen? We're smarter than this.
Apparently not.